Jack adjusted his rearview mirror, his tired eyes scanning the deserted street. It was an unusually quiet night in town, with the usual hum of late-night activity replaced by an eerie stillness. Fog blanketed the roads, swallowing streetlights and muffling sound. The dashboard clock flickered, stuck at 11:47 p.m., though Jack knew it had been that time for a while. He tapped the radio, hoping for a clear signal, but only faint static greeted him. Sighing, he resigned himself to another uneventful shift. The last ride had been hours ago, and Jack found himself cruising aimlessly, hoping for one last fare before heading home. Business had slowed since the new rideshare apps took over, but Jack stuck with his taxi. It was an old habit, like the late-night drives that once gave him peace, now only deepening his loneliness. Just as he considered calling it a night, his GPS beeped. He glanced at the screen. A new request appeared, unusual given the late hour. The location read, "End of the line, intersection 13. Jack frowned. He knew every corner of the town, but this address didn't ring a bell. For a moment he hesitated. The request felt off. Yet something pulled at him, a mix of curiosity and obligation. Maybe it was just another out-of-towner, lost and looking for a way back to the main road. With a resigned sigh, he tapped accept on the screen and turned the cab toward the fog-drenched outskirts. As he drove, the silence deepened. Even the hum of the engine seemed distant, swallowed by the thickening mist. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the night was about to change. He just didn't know how. The fog thickened as Jack approached the intersection. His headlights barely pierced the swirling mist, and the streets seemed emptier than ever. When he arrived at intersection 13, he was met with complete silence. There were no buildings nearby, just a flickering street lamp casting a dim circle of light on the cracked pavement. Jack scanned the area, ready to dismiss the call as a prank, when a figure emerged from the fog. The man was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. Without a word, he opened the back door and slid into the seat. "Where to?" Jack asked, his voice breaking the stillness. The passenger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his face still hidden in shadow. "Just drive," he said finally, his voice low and raspy. Jack hesitated, glancing at the GPS. The screen had gone blank, showing only static. "Look, I need an address," Jack insisted. The man tilted his head. "Follow the road ahead," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Jack sighed, put the cab in gear, and started driving. The road was unfamiliar, with no street signs or landmarks. The fog seemed to grow denser, wrapping around the taxi like a living thing. As they drove, Jack's unease deepened. The man in the back seat was unnervingly still, his presence heavy and oppressive. Jack tried to focus on the road, but his eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror. The passenger's face remained hidden, but Jack could feel his gaze. "Long night?" Jack asked, attempting to break the tension. The passenger chuckled softly, the sound devoid of humor. "You could say that," he replied. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Something was definitely wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. The road stretched on endlessly, straight and featureless. Jack had driven these routes for years, yet he couldn't place where they were. He glanced at the odometer. It felt like they'd been driving for miles, but the reading hadn't changed. "I don't recognize this road," Jack said, more to himself than the passenger. "You wouldn't," the man replied, his tone calm but unsettling. "It's not on any map." Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. He checked his phone for navigation, but it displayed only a spinning loading icon. The radio, too, was silent except for a faint, whispering static. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Jack tried to find markers, street signs, buildings, even another car, but there was nothing. The fog seemed to consume everything beyond the reach of the headlights. "Where are we going?" Jack finally asked, his voice tense. "Where you need to be," the man said cryptically. Jack's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel. He tried to turn the car around, but the road wouldn't let him. Every time he attempted a U-turn, He found himself back on the same stretch, the same endless path ahead. "I want off this road," Jack said, his voice rising in frustration. The passenger leaned forward slightly, his face still obscured. "There's no turning back now," he said. "Not for you." Jack's heart pounded. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he began to tell a story about a driver who once took a wrong turn and never found his way back. Jack listened, the man's words heavy with implication. By the time the passenger finished, Jack was sweating. He realized the story wasn't just a tale. It was a warning. Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. His mind raced, piecing together the man's cryptic words. The road stretched on unchanged, and the fog seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. "You know something about me," Jack said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The passenger didn't respond immediately. Then, in a tone as cold as the mist outside, he said, "Do you remember the night 5 years ago?" Jack's blood ran cold. His mouth went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." He lied. The man chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Yes, you do. The hit and run on Bellamy Street. The woman you left for dead." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't thought about that night in years, or rather, he tried not to. It was a mistake, a moment of panic. He told himself it wasn't his fault, but the guilt had never truly left him. "I didn't mean to," Jack whispered. "It was an accident. And yet you drove away," the passenger said. "You left her there alone." Jack's vision blurred as memories flooded back. The screech of tires, the thud of impact, the sight of a figure crumpled on the pavement in his rearview mirror. He'd driven off, telling himself there was nothing he could do. "You've been running ever since," the man continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "But this road has a way of catching up with you." Suddenly, figures began to appear in the fog. Jack squinted, his breath hitching as he realized they weren't ordinary people. They were ghostly, their faces pale and expressionless. Among them, Jack recognized the woman from that night. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on him. "No," Jack muttered, his voice shaking. "This can't be real." "It's real," the passenger said. "And now you must face it." Jack's hands tightened on the wheel as the figures drew closer, their silent gazes filled with accusation. Jack's pulse raced as the ghostly figures surrounded the cab. Their eyes, hollow and unblinking, bore into him. He could feel their judgment, their silent condemnation. "I'm sorry," Jack whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen." The woman stepped forward, her face pale but unmistakable. Jack's guilt surged as he met her gaze, seeing the pain and betrayal etched there. "What do you want from me?" Jack cried, his voice breaking. The passenger, now eerily quiet, watched from the back seat. "Redemption is earned, not given," he said. "You must confront the truth." Jack hesitated, then slowly opened the door. The cold, foggy air rushed in, and he stepped out, his legs trembling beneath him. The apparitions didn't move, but continued to stare, their presence suffocating. Falling to his knees, Jack clutched his head. "I've lived with this guilt every day," he said. "I've tried to move on, but I can't." Tears streamed down his face as he begged for forgiveness. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The figures remained silent, their forms flickering like candlelight in the wind. Then, slowly, the woman nodded. The fog began to lift, revealing the road ahead. The ghostly figures faded one by one, their features softening before vanishing entirely. Jack was left kneeling on the empty road, the weight of his confession heavy but freeing. He stood, the stillness around him now peaceful instead of oppressive. He turned back to the cab, where the passenger sat waiting, his expression unreadable. "Is it over?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse. The man didn't answer directly. "That depends on you," he said. Jack climbed back into the cab, his hands still trembling. He looked at the odometer. It read 0 miles, as if the journey had never happened. He glanced at the intersection, now clear of fog. Everything appeared normal, but Jack felt far from safe. The GPS lit up again, displaying a new message, end of the line. "No," Jack muttered, shaking his head. Not again. A knock on the passenger side window startled him. Turning, he saw a figure standing outside, their face obscured by the shadows. With a sense of dread, Jack unlocked the door. The figure slid in, their voice chillingly familiar as they gave the same command, just drive. The meter began to count down. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel, and he knew deep down, this road was far from finished with him. The hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence of the night. Ethan gripped the wheel, his knuckles pale under the dim light of the dashboard. The fog wrapped around his taxi like a shroud, smothering the road ahead. The occasional flicker of a distant streetlight provided brief glimpses of the empty street before vanishing again into the mist. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud in the cool air. The nights were always long, but something about this one felt different, heavier. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but all he could see was the swirling fog trailing behind. Another dead night, he muttered to himself, his voice rough from hours of silence. Ethan's thoughts drifted as they often did on these lonely drives. Memories of a different life, one where laughter and purpose filled the spaces now occupied by regret. But the past was a closed chapter, and he had no interest in reopening it. Ahead, a faint silhouette appeared, barely visible through the thick fog. His hands tightened on the wheel as he squinted, trying to make out the figure. Someone was standing in the middle of the road, raising a hand. Ethan slowed the taxi to a crawl, his heart thudding in his chest. Who would be out here at this hour? As the taxi came to a stop, the figure emerged from the fog, a young woman, pale and drenched, her dress stained with what looked like blood. She opened the passenger door without a word and slipped inside. Ethan swallowed hard. "Rough night?" he asked, forcing a casual tone. The woman didn't respond. She simply stared ahead, her hollow eyes fixed on something Ethan couldn't see. The fog seemed to thicken around them as he eased the car back onto the road. The woman's silence weighed heavily in the confined space of the taxi. Ethan tried to ignore the chill that seemed to radiate from her, but it was impossible. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he stole quick glances at her pale face. She sat unnaturally still, her gaze locked on the foggy road ahead. Ethan cleared his throat. "So, where are you headed?" For a moment, it seemed she wouldn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Home." Ethan frowned. "Where's home?" She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. The hollow emptiness in her stare sent a shiver down his spine. "You know the way." Ethan's stomach churned. Something about her voice felt familiar, but he couldn't place it. He wanted to press her for more information, but thought better of it. He focused instead on the road, though the fog made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, filling the car with an old, haunting tune. Ethan jolted in his seat, glancing at the dashboard. He hadn't touched the dial. The woman didn't react. Her voice cut through the melody like a knife. "You've been here before." Ethan's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "You'll see soon enough," she said, her tone flat but heavy with meaning. Ethan's pulse quickened. The temperature in the taxi plummeted, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He adjusted the rearview mirror again, but the fog behind them seemed denser, almost alive. The woman leaned forward slightly, her hollow eyes glinting in the dim light. "They're waiting for you." Before Ethan could respond, the fog swallowed the road ahead entirely. Ethan's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. The road was barely visible, the headlights doing little to pierce the dense fog. His mind raced with questions, but the woman's cryptic words lingered. "They're waiting for you." As the taxi moved slowly through the murk, shapes began to form along the roadside. At first, Ethan thought it was just the fog playing tricks on him, but then he saw them clearly, figures, pale and translucent, emerging from the mist. Each figure walked silently, their hollow eyes fixed on the taxi. Ethan's chest tightened. These weren't ordinary people. Their faces, though faint, stirred something deep within him. One by one, they turned their heads to follow the car as it passed. Ethan's grip on the wheel faltered. A memory surfaced. A car crash, twisted metal, and broken bodies scattered on the roadside. His breathing grew shallow. No, it's not real, he whispered, his voice trembling. The young woman spoke again, her tone cold and deliberate. You remember them, don't you? Ethan's heart pounded. Who are they? They're the ones you left behind, she said, her voice heavy with accusation. Ethan's vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. He remembered the night vividly now, the rain, the slick road, the sudden impact. He had walked away without looking back, leaving the others to their fate. The fog thickened as the taxi approached a bend in the road. A large, decrepit house loomed ahead, barely visible through the swirling mist. The young woman gestured toward it. Stop here, she said. Ethan hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to turn around and drive as far as he could. But his hands, as if guided by an unseen force, brought the taxi to a halt in front of the house. The figures from the fog began to gather around, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse racing as the young woman stepped out of the car. Come inside, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally in the still night. Ethan stood at the edge of the driveway, staring up at the crumbling house. Its windows were dark, and its walls were covered in creeping vines. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The young woman walked ahead, her bare feet silent on the cracked pavement. Ethan's legs felt heavy, but he forced himself to follow her. Each step toward the house felt like a step deeper into a nightmare. Inside, the air was colder, heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. The furniture was draped in dusty sheets, and the walls were lined with faded photographs. Ethan hesitated, his eyes drawn to one photo in particular, a group of people smiling at a roadside picnic. He recognized them instantly. The woman's voice cut through the silence. You knew them. They trusted you. Ethan turned, his chest tightening. It was an accident. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. She shook her head, her expression hardening. You left them to die. Suddenly, the house seemed to come alive. The faded figures from the fog materialized in the room, their hollow eyes filled with silent accusation. One of them stepped forward, a middle-aged man Ethan remembered as the driver of the other car. His face was pale, his eyes empty. Ethan backed away. I couldn't save you. I was scared. The man's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the room filled with the sound of screeching tires and shattering glass. Ethan clutched his head, overwhelmed by the cacophony of the crash. The young woman stepped closer, her face now inches from his. You can't run from the past forever. Ethan sank to his knees, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. What do you want from me? The woman knelt beside him, her voice soft but unyielding. You must face the truth. Only then can you decide if you're worthy of redemption. Ethan's vision blurred as the ghostly figures closed in, their presence suffocating. The house seemed to pulse with their collective grief and anger. Choose, the woman whispered. Face your past, or remain here with us forever. Ethan struggled to his feet, his breathing ragged. The ghostly figures surrounded him, their hollow eyes unblinking. The young woman remained in front of him, her expression unreadable. You can't change what happened, Ethan said, his voice hoarse. I know that now. The young woman tilted her head slightly. But you can choose what happens next. A door creaked open at the end of the hall, revealing a dimly lit room. Ethan hesitated, but the woman nodded toward it. He stepped forward, his heart pounding with every step. Inside, the room was bare except for a single object, a cracked mirror. Ethan approached it, dreading what he might see. As he gazed into the mirror, his reflection began to shift. He saw himself on the night of the accident, young, reckless, and full of fear. The reflection spoke, its voice cold and distant. You've carried this guilt for too long. It's time to make amends. The young woman appeared beside him in the mirror. You have a choice, Ethan. Sacrifice your own peace to guide those you've wronged, or join them in their torment. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. How do I guide them? By facing your guilt and helping others avoid your mistakes, she said. But it will not be easy. The pain will remain. Ethan closed his eyes, his body trembling. I'll do it. I'll face it. The mirror cracked further, and the ghostly figures began to fade, their eyes softening. The young woman's expression lightened, her voice now gentle. Then your journey begins. Ethan emerged from the house, the air around him still heavy, but no longer suffocating. The fog began to lift, revealing the road ahead. The young woman stood beside him, her blood-stained dress now clean, her eyes calm. You've taken the first step. They will rest easier now. Ethan nodded, his face lined with exhaustion but also determination. Will I ever find peace? The woman offered a faint smile. In time, perhaps. As she faded into the mist, Ethan climbed back into his taxi. He gripped the steering wheel, his hand steady for the first time in years. The road stretched out before him, clearer now, but still shrouded in mystery. Ethan drove on, his reflection in the rearview mirror, showing a man forever changed. Behind him, the fog began to gather again. In its swirling depths, a new figure appeared, waiting for their turn to face the truth. And so, the cycle continued. The rain drummed steadily on the taxi's roof as Daniel adjusted his rearview mirror. His reflection stared back at him, tired, with deep lines etched around his blue eyes. He ran a hand through his graying hair and sighed, shifting in his seat. Nights like this used to feel peaceful, but lately, they only brought him an unsettling stillness. The city streets were nearly empty, bathed in the hazy glow of Rain Street streetlights. Water pooled on the cracked asphalt, reflecting the distorted images of distant neon signs. Daniel kept the radio on for company, though it was mostly static, an almost comforting background noise. His cab glided through the slick streets, wipers swishing rhythmically, the monotony lulling him into a false sense of calm. As he turned onto a quieter road, the static on the radio suddenly cleared. A soft, almost familiar voice emerged from the speakers, barely audible over the rain. Daniel, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. He glanced at the radio, frowning. The voice was gone, replaced once more by static. A chill ran down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. He shook his head, brushing it off as his imagination playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew that voice. It had been a year, but he could never forget it. It was Emma's. She had been one of his last passengers before she vanished without a trace. He told himself he wasn't responsible, that he had only done his job that night. Still, guilt had lingered like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. Lost in thought, Daniel almost missed the next turn. He straightened the wheel and refocused, his heart beating just a little faster now. Something about tonight felt different. The rain continued to pour as Daniel drove through the dimly lit streets, but his mind was no longer on the road. The voice on the radio haunted him, and the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. It was Emma. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences intensified. It always started the same way. Static on the radio would clear momentarily, and her voice would break through, whispering his name or a few disjointed words. At first, he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to exhaustion. But soon, other passengers began noticing odd things too. Feels colder in here than outside, a man muttered one evening, pulling his coat tighter. Another woman, seated in the back, shifted uncomfortably. You ever feel like someone's watching you? She asked, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. Daniel forced a chuckle, brushing off their comments. But inside, he was shaken. His cab had always been his refuge, a space where he could disconnect from the world. Now it felt like something or someone had invaded it. One night, as he waited at a red light, Daniel glanced into the rearview mirror. His breath caught in his throat. For a split second, he saw her, Emma, sitting in the back seat, her dark eyes meeting his. Her expression was blank, almost sorrowful. He spun around, heart racing, but the seat was empty. The light turned green, and the car behind him honked. Daniel quickly refocused, but his hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. He couldn't deny it any longer. Emma was there, or at least, something of her was. And she wasn't just haunting his cab. She was trying to tell him something. Daniel couldn't shake the memory of Emma's face. He replayed their last ride in his mind. Her nervous glances out the window. The way she clutched her bag tightly. She had been scared. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it gnawed at him. Driven by guilt and a need for answers, Daniel decided to investigate. He parked outside the quiet suburban street where he had dropped Emma off that night. The house she had entered was dark, abandoned for months now. Rain pattered softly on the car as Daniel stared at the empty windows, his mind racing. Later at home, he scoured the internet for news articles. It didn't take long to find one. Missing woman last seen entering taxi. The photo of Emma beside the headline made his chest tighten. The article detailed how she had disappeared without a trace, leaving friends and family devastated. But there was more. According to witnesses, Emma had been seen arguing with a man earlier that night. The police suspected foul play, but never found enough evidence to make an arrest. The radio in Daniel's cab crackled to life again during his next shift. This time, Emma's voice was clearer. Find the truth. The words sent a shiver down his spine. He knew what he had to do. Emma's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime. And somehow, she believed he could help uncover what had happened. Daniel started reaching out to passengers who had ridden with him that night. Most were hesitant to talk, but one man remembered seeing Emma get into his cab, followed by a black sedan that had been trailing them. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was more terrifying than Daniel had expected. The next night, Daniel's radio buzzed with static again. Emma's voice broke through, clearer than ever. "Drive to the old warehouse," she said. Daniel's pulse quickened. He knew the place, an abandoned structure on the outskirts of town, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. It was a place people avoided, rumored to be a haven for criminal activity. With trembling hands, Daniel followed her instructions. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. As he approached the warehouse, the radio emitted a sharp, ear-splitting shriek. Then silence. Daniel parked and turned off the engine. He sat in the quiet for a moment, gathering his courage. But before he could step out, the temperature in the cab plummeted. His breath fogged the air, and a soft glow emanated from the back seat. He turned slowly. Emma was there, fully visible for the first time. Her pale skin seemed almost translucent, her dark hair falling around her face in damp strands. She wore the same outfit she had on the night she disappeared. Her eyes were sad but resolute. "You brought me here," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. Emma nodded. "This is where it happened," she said, her voice soft but steady. "This is where I died." Daniel's stomach churned. He had driven her here, unaware of the danger she was walking into. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know you were in trouble." Emma's expression softened. "I don't blame you," she said, "but you can help me now." She explained that her killer had been someone she knew, someone she was trying to escape. The warehouse had been their meeting place, but it turned into her grave. "You need to find him," Emma said. "Bring him to justice." Daniel nodded, his fear replaced by determination. He had failed Emma once, but he wouldn't fail her again. Daniel spent the next few days retracing Emma's steps. With her guidance, he pieced together clues, each one pointing to a man who had ridden in his cab multiple times, a local businessman with a clean reputation but a dark secret. The man had been in Emma's life, controlling and abusive, and when she tried to escape, he ensured she couldn't. Daniel remembered him now, a cold, calculating figure who always tipped generously but never made eye contact. With Emma's help, Daniel gathered enough evidence to confront him. Late one night, he waited outside the man's office. When he finally emerged, Daniel stepped forward, his heart pounding. "We need to talk," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. The man's eyes narrowed. "Do I know you?" "You knew Emma," Daniel said, watching for a reaction. The man's expression flickered, a brief crack in his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, turning to leave. But Daniel had come prepared. He had photos of the black sedan trailing his cab that night, along with witness statements. He knew it wasn't enough to convict the man outright, but it was enough to draw attention. "If you don't confess," Daniel said, "I'll take this to the police." The man hesitated, then glared at Daniel. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he hissed. But Daniel stood his ground. For Emma, he wouldn't back down. Days later, the man was arrested, his crimes finally brought to light. The relief was bittersweet. Daniel knew it wouldn't bring Emma back, but it gave her the justice she deserved. One night, as Daniel drove through the quiet city streets, the radio crackled again. This time, Emma's voice was soft, almost peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered. In the rearview mirror, Daniel saw her one last time, her figure glowing faintly before fading into the night. The cab felt warmer, lighter, as though a great burden had been lifted. But just as Daniel thought it was over, the radio crackled once more. A new voice, faint and desperate, called out, "Help me!" Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. He knew his journey with the dead was far from over.